Oh, hi everyone. Welcome to the session. I hope you enjoy your lunch. We still have some dessert left over there if you want to grab one after the keynote. And also we have coffee and drinks outside there. So feel free to refill and get more and get energetic for our afternoon sessions. Um, I'm Yang Wang. I'm a faculty member here in Language Literacy Education, and I'm the co-director of the Bilingualism Matters Center at USC. I'm very glad to be here to introduce our keynote speaker for this session. Uh, I will try to pronounce her name and then she can correct me, I guess, after this. Dr. Lola Ascenzi Moreno is a professor of bilingual education at the School of Education at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. She also serves as the bilingual program coordinator in the Childhood, Bilingual, and Special Education department. She received her doctorate in urban education from the City University of New York, Graduate Center in 2012. Prior to becoming a professor, she was a dual language teacher and coach in New York City public schools for more than a decade. Her research areas include bilingual education, biliteracy, reading assessment, writing, and bilingual teacher education. Her publication can be found in the Journal of Literacy Research and Instruction, Language and Education, Schools Studies and Education, Voices from the Middle, Language Arts, and the Reading Teacher. Her recent published book, I have a copy right here. This is my copy. You can borrow to have a look. Rooted in Strength, the Power of Multilingualism and Translanguaging. This book demonstrates the importance of using children's multilingualism as a strength in reading and writing instruction. So we are thrilled to have Dr. Lola Ascenzi Moreno with us today. Her presentation titled A Multilingual Perspective on Literacy, a Tool for Understanding the Position of Emergent Bilinguals Resources. We'll discuss the importance of centering multilingualism in reading for bilingual, multilingual learners. So let's welcome Dr. Lola Ascenzi Moreno.
Thank you so much, Yang, for that introduction. 1 second as I set up my presentation. I really want to thank everyone here at Bilingualism Matters. I know that they've worked so hard to create a conference where we can come together and think about multilingualism as it stems from research and practice. I especially appreciated Dr. Sorace's words this morning about the different angles in which we need to view bilingualism. And today, my talk, Multilingual Perspective on Literacy, a tool for understanding the positioning of emergent bilinguals resources, will focus on issues from the field. And to use these issues from the field as a lens to understand bilingualism and how emergent bilinguals are currently positioned. And I should say that my talk is really based on the US context. I believe that understanding this positioning is key for bilingual professionals, education professionals, and researchers because it informs our actions and responses that move towards equitable instruction for emergent bilinguals. I also was inspired by Dr. Titone's talk, and I wanted to make a connection between her framework of social and ecological factors that impact individuals. And in particular, the talk that I'm going to give today is about how those social and ecological factors in schools and school policies support bilingual people or do not support bilingual people. So I want to start my talk with two stories. As Yang said, I was a former elementary school teacher. I still am a teacher because I teach teachers. So now as a bilingual teacher and researcher, my focus is on how bilingualism is experienced and lived in schools. So next slide. I don't know how to change the slides. Did that work? Okay. Sorry, there are two green buttons here. So this particular snippet comes from research that I conducted on reading assessments and something that I dubbed responsive adaptations, which are flexible ways that teachers can adapt reading assessments in favor of multilingualism. An example, for example, is asking students to respond using language resources that can best express their comprehension. So students, typically when kids read a book, let's say in English, and we ask them, what was this book about? Tell me about the characters. Many teachers will expect their expression to only be in English to mirror the language of the book. In this work that I did, we discovered that children use of translanguaging can be very helpful for teachers to understand their extent of their comprehension. So we're looking at reading as a broad construct rather than a linguistic construct. I think you can look at both. You can think about reading as a broad construct, but you can also look at reading in a particular language as well. But those required two different assessments. So this teacher decided to do some professional development with the staff at the school. And she was talking about her understandings. And what she said was this. I'm sorry, I can't. Some teachers were vocally opposed to making adaptations because they thought that they made the assessment invalid and meaningless. I explained it is a test designed for monolingual students, and if we don't make some of these adaptations and be flexible in our thinking. Okay, sorry, I need to change, I can't see. I was telling someone, this is what happens when you're 50. I can't see, but okay. Some teachers were vocally opposed to making adaptations because they thought that these made the assessment invalid and meaningless. I explained it is a test designed for monolingual students, and if we don't make some of these adaptations and be flexible in our thinking, we are penalizing these students and not recognizing the skills that they do have. So in this short snippet, she's saying, let's make adaptations so we can truly get to the understanding of what these students understand about this text. And teachers were like, no, we can't do that. We're disadvantaging the English students because in this case, Spanish speaking students are going to appear stronger than what we expect them to. All these kernels of So the next story I wanted to show is from a current research project that I'm working on. I am going into pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade classrooms in dual language bilingual classrooms and observing phonics instruction and foundational reading instruction. And I happened upon, I think, a genius child, as I often do, because so many children display their genius. So in this episode, children were in this dual language bilingual class, and they were at literacy centers, which are, small groups working on skills. So they had just finished a whole group lesson, and I was observing a group where there was this child named Germán. Germán is a Spanish speaker. He's in a dual language class, and he's at a literacy center. And at this literacy center, they're pulling out nonsense words and they're reading them. And there's like a game-like component of it. But he takes it out, he looks at it, he doesn't recognize it as a word either in English or Spanish. And he says to his teacher, wait, are we supposed to use our sounds in Spanish or in English to figure this out? I think that these two anecdotes are important for us today. Sorry. Excuse me, I'm managing two systems at the same time. These stories matter to us as bilingual educators and researchers because I think they illuminate active sites of work for our research and our practice. I think these stories are connected because they present a challenge to us to examine how bilingualism sits in relation to literacy. In the first story, we see that teachers at the school view reading assessments as neutral and valid and are confused when they're calls to adapt them so they are more multilingual. For me, this made me realize how ingrained monolingualism is in assessment. but it also helped me to understand that educators often use assessments to confirm generalizations about emergent bilinguals, particularly racialized emergent bilinguals. And when I say racialized emergent bilinguals, we often talk about bilingualism as neutral, but it's not neutral. I think several years ago, you had my colleague Nelson Flores here who talked about it's different if Princess Charlotte speaks Spanish, he always uses this example, versus if a child, Afro-Latinx student, let's say from the Dominican Republic, is using Spanish. I do not think that this is explicit, but these ideologies permeate literacy and assessment and sometimes remain undetected. We assume, oh, this assessment is valid and neutral, and it's just showing us, the results, when in fact, the assessment process and the way that monolingualism pervades it may actually give us skewed results. And what's evident in Germán's question is that although these messages that we're, as educators, is that we want to project that bilingualism is valued, his question to his teacher demonstrates that it's confusing to students. While his dual language program states that he wants to lift up students' bilingualism, the curriculum and the policies that we actually put in place in a bilingual program many times run counter to the overarching goal. So I think that the crux of both of these stories is that students' bilingualism is not at the center of literacy practices at this current moment, and we need to think about how they can be. And we have a lot of work to make sure that they are. The question that I think in relation to these issues raised by these anecdotes is how can a multilingual perspective on literacy support teachers and education professionals to design instruction that's equitable, effective, and centered on emergent bilingual resources and language practices. So today I want to accomplish 3 main things. One second. Sorry for all the bloopers. So first, I want to think about what's a monolingual bias and how does it permeate reading instruction. And then I want to talk about why are conceptualizations of reading a critical issue for the field of bilingual education. And lastly, how can reading instruction, and emergent bilingual readers be reframed through a multilingual perspective? So I'm going to ask you to pretend that you're in a early elementary classroom. So right now in the United States, doing abundant phonemic awareness, decoding is all the rage. And in my observations, I often see tasks like this. If I take away T from turf and put an S, what do I make? Okay. And then, which word is different? Pepper, letter, perfect. Which one is different for you? Why? So what is the, no, and these are actual activities that I've taken from my observations. So what's the instructional intention of these exercises? And I'm asking for your participation. What do you think the intention of the first exercise is? Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. And what's the intention of the second one? Yeah. Well, these may be explicit for us as bilingual educators and researchers, but the challenges that emergent bilinguals or monolingual students have when they are posed with these questions are very different. So when, let's say this is a first grader, so someone who's 6 or 7 years old hears, if I take away T from turf and put an S, they may still be listening to the instructions and not even understand what you're asking me to do. If they do understand what is being asked to do, because a lot of these activities are done really, really quickly, they have no idea what they're saying. They're just sounds. And as one teacher said so eloquently, my class is clueless. That's not, but she said, my class is clueless. They're doing all the segmentation. They're doing all this. They're doing all the things they're supposed to be doing, but they're clueless about this. The same goes with the activity with which word is different, pepper, letter, or perfect. Sometimes students, as I saw here, there was some confusion. Well, they're all different. I think what they wanted first graders to say is letter because it starts with an L. But if you have a more sophisticated first grader, they might say perfect because it doesn't have the ER at the end. So we don't really know. So I think it's really important as bilingual educators, researchers, and professionals to think about, do these prompts have the same effect on emergent bilinguals as monolinguals? And if they don't, what effect are they having on emergent bilinguals? So from that exercise, we see that these activities have the potential to favor some students, like monolingual students, and emergent bilinguals actually may not get what we intend out of them. The attention of many reading exercise has been premised on monolingualism and monolingual students, and even in Spanish. So as a dual language bilingual teacher, we have students who are learning Spanish, students who are learning English, and we assume that everybody interacts with these activities in the same way. But I think we need to question that assumption. So the concept of monolingual bias is critical, and I think an impetus for change, because it sheds light that conceptualizations of reading that we hold are not neutral. And I love this little cartoon, which is for a fair selection, everyone has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And we can see that they're all animals, but obviously different ones have different abilities to complete that task. So I'm going to go on a little, it's not a tangent, I'm going to go on a little explanation before. So the way that we teach reading is couched in neutrality. And we educators, because I'm speaking from the educational applied research standpoint, are told this is what the data says. This is how people learn. And these principles apply to everyone, especially in reading instruction. There are now a lot of calls for universality. All students benefit from X. If we just do X, everybody will learn to read. But we see bias woven into the ways that human activity is designed. And one of the recent ways that I've understood how bias is crafted into design and can illuminate this for reading is through the following example. I don't know if you've seen this documentary on Netflix called Coded Bias. And in the documentary, we find out the story of Joy Buolamwini, I think that's how you say it, whose work is on algorithmic bias. She discovered that facial recognition software did not recognize her face because she's Black. And the people who coded the software were not coding for differential skin color. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that just truly amazing? The coders for facial recognition software did not take into account darker skin colors. And this afternoon, I got an email from the National Council of Teachers that she will be one of the keynotes at that conference. So the connection is there. What if we apply this understanding to reading and think about if we conceive of reading is designed with a similar bias, with some students in mind, or presuming monolingualism is always a feature of reading? And I went to this interesting talk. It was the second session. I forgot who was talking, the name of the research, but looking at dialect and saying, we often think of monolinguals as a monolith, but monolinguals aren't. So I think that we're also kind of masking the differences of monolinguals when we think about reading as well. So why do we need to speak about how reading is conceptualized? I think because in the end, it affects reading policy in very intimate ways. I think sometimes when we think about bilingual education policy, we think about larger policies and not the policies that govern day-to-day reading instruction, which then leaves it open to influence and monolingual bias. So policy happens at different levels. And from my vantage point as a reading teacher and researcher, policies that affect school structures may change, like the addition of a new program or the structure of these programs, the governance of a school. But the professional development that teachers often receive about reading and reading instruction continues to be framed under a monolingual perspective and remains unquestioned. And I experienced this myself. In the school where I worked at, everyone was so excited that we were opening a bilingual program in the school, in the neighborhood. But really, when you went down to the fine grain, we weren't doing very radical instruction within the school. So we need to think about levels of policy and how those levels are coherent and consistent. Oops. Again, I'm so sorry. I'm not doing a great job with the clicker. Yet, I don't think we can ever have true reform, especially as it benefits multilingual learners, if we don't acknowledge that reading has been conceived in certain ways. If we're teaching reading in English or Spanish, it's always been conceived through a monolingual standpoint. So if I'm reading a text in English, it assumes that I'm familiar with all the words and the experiences. And the same is true in Spanish. It assumes a monolingual student. And I want to show here, I did like a 2-minute search in my personal library of professional books. And this is how I always see emergent bilinguals or bilinguals positioned in relation to general teaching pedagogy. So here on the top, how to scaffold for ELs so they can better comprehend grade level text. So it's always an add-on, tips or tricks. I don't know how many people here are teachers, but this is how I think emergent bilinguals are often positioned in pedagogy books, or here, English language learners and pragmatic awareness. So if you want to know a little bit about that, here, there's a little snippet. And this is just a taste of how teachers are getting information about how to support bilingual readers in monolingual classrooms, for example. So why is a critical lens important to understanding how teachers carry out literacy instruction for emergent bilinguals? I love this quote by Frankel and Brooks because it takes a bird's eye view of reading rather than an individual view, or seeing reading as a phenomenon that only happens at the level of the individual. And this quote brings into focus politically and ideologically neutral conceptualizations of literacy learning. They often dominate reading instruction and determine who readers are. And this also connects to Dr. Titona's talk, where we're really thinking that individuals exist within a context. Frankel and Brooks write, the power dynamics and structural inequities that contribute to standard definitions of readers and reading locate difficulties within the reader without accounting for broader social, cultural, and historical context of literacy policies, testing, and instruction. And I think we need to consider both. So to exemplify this point, I want to pull in some data and findings from a paper I wrote with Dr. Kate Seltzer, who's at Montclair, about how language ideologies circulate through reading assessments. So we're going to go back and explore this anecdote. This is the anecdote about the teacher who was presenting to other teachers about reading assessment and adapting reading assessments in favor of multilingualism. So in the study we did, we wove together a ratio-linguistic perspective with translanguaging theory to understand how the ideologies that circulate through formative assessments or assessments that are done by teachers differentially affect racialized emergent bilinguals. Translanguaging, which is the flexible use of languages, I am not doing a presentation on translanguaging, but just to give people an idea, thinking about language as one unitary repertoire, was conceptualized as a tool for dismantling ideologies that negatively impact the educational experiences of emergent bilinguals. And we use ratiolinguistics as a theory to provide a lens for why students are rendered languageless, for example. And ratiolinguistics is a field where we think about who is the speaker and how is that person being listened to. Oops. That was just that slide. Sorry, guys. So one of the first things we found was that teachers internalized and upheld through their practice the inherent validity, neutrality, and infallibility of assessments. Because assessments measure language and literacy practice through a monolingual lens, emergent bilinguals will never measure up and will continue to be viewed through a deficit lens. So we see this short exchange between Vanessa and Julie, two ENL teachers who primarily work with low-income Latinx students. So what I want to highlight here is this is qualitative, obviously. So Vanessa, one of the teachers, says, we can't do accommodations. And Julie says, we're really not allowed to make them, although I have. And Vanessa responds, it's an assessment. So after this exchange, Julie went to talk on further about how the types of adjustments she makes to assessments. But Vanessa stood firm and said they had to follow the guidelines and follow each student's level. So in contrast to Julie's discussion of how she based her assessment decisions on understanding students, Vanessa's response demonstrates her adherence to external procedures and assessment regulations. So framed in this way, Julie's criticality about whether reading assessments are appropriately assessing emergent bilinguals is viewed as suspect and a threat to obtaining valid results. By pitting official assessments and guidelines against her knowledge or teacher knowledge, teachers are limited in what they can do, what they can learn, and ultimately how they can view and instruct emergent bilinguals. And the second finding I wanted to highlight here is that assessment practices further marginalize emergent bilinguals of color because they're tied to teachers' conceptualizations of what reading is and the overall capabilities of racialized emergent bilingual readers. And we showed this in our paper through juxtaposing teachers' talk about assessing their different students. So in this study, I had teachers who worked in a French-English dual language program and teachers who worked with emergent bilinguals who are low income and Latinx. So in these two statements, Vanessa again says about her students, if you're not a good reader, you're going to struggle with everything, basically with everything else. So we concentrate on reading because if they love to read, they'll become good writers. I think it's something that they lack because when they go home, they don't have that. Essentially, we interpreted this quote as saying, well, my students at home really have no resources in terms of literacy instruction. So we have to do everything at school because without that, they're going to fail. While Audrey, who is a teacher in the French-English program, discussed her students in a different light. We try to tell the French-speaking parents that having a lower reading level in English is a normal part of their development. And this is particular to New York City. We have to write 2s and 1s on their report card sometimes. And yes, parents are a little bit upset because it's unfair why Francophones are held to the same standards as English-speaking students. So here, while Vanessa is talking about students' future capabilities as students overall, Audrey is really saying she used like that students, yes, they're going to be performing at a lower level in English because it's just natural. They're developing their English. While Vanessa, and this was throughout our sample, the Latinx students were always seen at risk. You know, they're at risk. They may not become literate. I think that these stories and this data challenge us as bilingual researchers to examine the mechanisms of how bilingualism has been relegated to the fringes of reading and literacy, and what we can do to ensure that we play a part in reimagining and creating literacy spaces where bilingualism is at the center. So I would like to talk a little bit about how within the school context, monolingualism becomes baked into curriculum. So as we see from this kind of, I put arrows, monolingual bias is threaded throughout and actually contributes to shaping how students are conceived and the roles that teachers take on. I hear this more frequently where I'm from, where teachers are concerned about implementing curriculum with fidelity. So teachers are expected to implement curriculum faithfully, or what we say with fidelity, without regard for how multilingual students develop as readers. So just like how Julie was talking about, why don't we adapt the assessments in favor of monolingualism? Teachers are not encouraged to do that at all. They're handed a program and they're expected to implement that program. In fact, recently I've seen lots of teachers, and I was discussing this with faculty yesterday, are holding the book and reading the book instead of making any types of adaptations, even if students don't understand what they're supposed to do, because the curriculum was created for monolinguals in mind. And then teachers are turned into implementers of curriculum, and they are valued for fixed instructional routines instead of creativity and craft around adapting curriculum. So going more into how this mechanism affects emergent bilinguals, monolingual perspectives on literacy leads to instruction that's limited in its potential to leverage linguistic and cultural resources of multilingual students. So teachers start implementing routinized procedures that are tethered to curriculum rather than tethered to the students, and therefore, I believe, cannot fully address students' learning trajectories. They're implementing routinized procedures that are based on monolingual experiences. And as a result, some students, especially the emergent bilinguals, are not learning as expected and therefore labeled negatively. So multilingual students are continued to be positioned at the margins of instruction and within the realms of specialists. So at this point, I think reading is envisioned and enacted in school as a fixed instructional routine that is rule-based and can be seen as neutral and external to teachers, even when it's for bilingual students. And in essence, in relation to reading, bilingualism is often seen outside of the norm, and bilingual readers are considered a specialized group that can only be attended to by specialists, either bilingual teachers or ENL teachers. I think that the deeper story that these data tell us is that reading policies are out of line and do not match students' natural languaging, how they use language, their histories, and their evolving identities. So despite that kind of bleak story, I think there's hope. There's more attention to literacy than before, and there's an opportunity to think about complexity. Complexity is good for teachers. I think it's good for schools and students, and we can't conflate complexity with complicated or difficult. I think complexity is good and can be aligned to creativity, nuance, and change. Again, I'm thinking of Dr. Titone's keynote this morning and how she talked about the individual stories. You know, we think about generalizations, but there is a lot of power in the individual stories and the relationships that we have with our emergent bilingual students. So before I go on, I wanted to ask you, how does reading exist for you now? And how does reading, what did you read today? You can just call out what kinds of things are you reading and how are you reading? Audiobooks. In text form? Okay, text. Program of the conference on your phone or on your phone, and text. How many people looked at Instagram, Facebook, TikTok? So reading is changing. So what we said, I mean, and we're a specific population, right? So we are people who read texts, but reading currently doesn't always look like that picture there. What I want to highlight with this slide is that reading is changing, and it's changed for all of us. And I think it's especially changed for people like I think of my children who are 10 and 12. And I took some of these pictures from what they see. If we think about how we engaged in reading today, we would see that picking up a printed text is just one of the ways that we've engaged as readers. First, all readers, the way reading exists is in a much larger space than just the traditional texts that are the ones that are primarily focused on in school. So even though our reading habits have changed and teachers are probably reading online, like the newspaper, getting information from TikTok and Instagram, the way that they teach in schools is primarily through traditional texts. And not that that's bad. I think traditional texts are really important, but it's not the only way, and it doesn't match the way that children are reading, and especially emergent bilinguals. Reading is not static, but a dynamic and social activity that is developed by the people who do it. But yet, in schools, definitions of reading continue to be dominated by text-based notions of what reading means. But children are creating different habits and competencies around reading, which reflect their social dynamics and resources. When we look at the ways in which we're reading, we can clearly see that reading is a cultural and social activity that's shaped by people and contexts. And here are some things. I don't know if you've seen Discord. Discord is like a platform that people can kind of have group chats on. TikTok, Scratch, which is a coding, Twitch, another platform, and then the traditional text like Last Stop on Market Street. But you can consume traditional text through various means. Okay, how does reading exist for emergent bilinguals? So this is just a slice or imagining of how reading exists for some emergent bilinguals, and I'm really focused on emergent bilinguals who are Spanish speaking in the Northeast. The first picture is Pura Belpre. I don't know if you know who Pura Belpre is. She's the first Puerto Rican librarian in New York City, and she was a pioneer in New York City. The things I loved about her work is that she integrated culture and multimodality. Here she's holding up puppets of the Cucaracha Martina. Cucaracha Martina is folklore from the Caribbean about a beautiful cockroach. I know it sounds funny, but that's the way it is. It's about a beautiful cockroach who has lots of suitors. And I think that this example is important because it shows that, I mean, you can see that Pura Belpre, this is like the 1960s, from always the ways that emergent bilinguals, their funds of knowledge, have maybe not matched what is valued in schools. At the bottom, I'm featuring Bad Bunny, who's part of children's literacy. Here you see I don't know where he is, but this to me looks like New York City. He's in front of a bodega. And I think that that is a really important part of children's literacy. And again, it encapsulates the resources that children have. I'm also highlighting two print-based texts. One is by Jose Luis Orozco, whose songs are very common. This is Mexican American or Mexican. And then Mi Papi Tiene Una Motocicleta, which features translanguaging. What's evident in all these texts is that they're multimodal, multilingual, and they're contextual or place-based. Bilingualism is not just about language, but it's about people and how the language is contextualized. And it's about how we value the resources that those bilingual and multilingual people bring into the classroom. And I think the big idea here is that literacy and identity are co-constructed. So I've talked a lot about this, but I want to emphasize that reading really bridges the individual with social processes. Reading is language, social participation, cultural membership, and identity negotiation, especially if we take a broad view of reading to include digital ways of reading. And I didn't even include community-based ways of reading. Reading can be viewed as an active meaning-making process that's centered on the person as they interact with things and beings in the world. I'm going to go really quickly through these slides. And this, I think a lot of what I'm writing here mirrors some of the sessions that we had this morning. Multilingual literacy should incorporate critical perspectives on language, content, and context. Listening comprehension is necessary for decoding. Something that's being talked about in the general reading world is executive functioning skills, and how executive functioning skills are important for students to support the development of decoding and listening comprehension. And I'm thinking about the presentation by Federica Festi this morning, where she was comparing bilinguals and multilinguals and talking about the orchestration of so many skills in comparison to monolinguals. Furthermore, oracy, or the development of language through oral language, and metalinguistic skills, I'm sorry, I missed a D there, are critical in reading development, and language comprehension should be woven throughout how emergent bilinguals in their entire literacy journey. I'm particularly concerned as an educator, a bilingual educator, that students will engage in copious amounts of decoding and foundational skills and not have the comprehension that they need in order to engage and enjoy texts. And students' cultural experiences also impact their background knowledge and influences their knowledge of sounds, letters, and words. Even if kids are not literate, they have knowledge of sounds, letters, and words from the languages that their parents speak. So I wanted to quickly talk. I'm doing a horrible job with this clicker stuff, about translanguaging and reading. For me, applying a translanguaging lens to reading has helped me to understand the reading process for emergent bilinguals. Understanding how their language and their reading is a necessary step, I think, for teachers to understand how reading is positioned and to design instruction. And this, I just wanted to, I just wanted to highlight here, sorry. This is a language portrait of a student who talked about drew about how they live their languages. And I think what's so funny is that this student put English, Spanish, and swimming. I know it's, okay. So a translanguaging vision of reading helps us to imagine readers as not, and reading as not being a set of external tasks, but also thinking about reading as an internal process. And I think that these two quotes from Garcia and Zapata and Kubi really help us. That students interact with monolingual texts, which have supposedly static linguistic features, but are transformed and mobilized by bilingual readers who bring their entire selves, their language, multilingualism, and multimodalities, their emotions, their bodies, and lives into the text. So they're not just reading static words, but they're bringing their person into an interpretation. And this is like Rosenblatt's interactional theory of reading. And languages are experiences deeply enmeshed spaces with sensations and experiences. It's not just learning a word, basically. So as emergent bilinguals read, they write, learn, and communicate. They draw on their linguistic features. So for example, here with this book, The Rainbow Weaver, La Tejedora del Arco Iris, a student who reads this, and this is a picture from a classroom where I observed, can read it in Spanish, but respond to it in English. She can respond to it in both English and Spanish. And I think that engagement represents a deep connection to the text. I'm going to skip a couple of things. Because I want to spend the last 5 minutes talking about, well, what does this look like? How could this be different? How can this look in schools and classrooms? And I'm going to focus on one component of literacy, which is foundational literacy. While researchers from a variety of fields do not advocate a one-size-fits-all approach to early literacy instruction, often the urgency to address early reading skills has been translated to a blanket approach for reading, regardless of their profiles. While emergent bilinguals need foundational reading instruction, their unique learning trajectories demand a different approach, such as drawing on their entire linguistic repertoire. And I went into like a long search because when I was a kid, my mom, who's from Colombia, would bring me these abecedarios. And oops, again, I'm so sorry. Would bring me these abecedarios, and they were all like this. Mi papá fume la pipa, or like, mi mamá me ama. And so I wanted to do this. So my question to educators and bilingual researchers is, how do we strive to teach foundational skills in a way that uplifts and affirms children's experiences, language, and knowledge? And again, going back to the question, the original question, do all students, including multilingual students, need the same foundational reading instruction to support their reading development? And how would that look to be different? Okay. So what's the next step? As we know, I've talked about this a lot, that reading is cumulative while it can be componential or broken up into components, but their histories and backgrounds impact their understanding. The ability to meta language or to think and talk about relationships between language is critical for emergent bilinguals. And I think what a multilingual perspective on reading can help us understand how foundational reading instruction cannot continue to proceed monolingually without attention to students' language resources needing or meta language. So here's something that may reframe how teachers can do this component. So imagine, and I haven't seen many classrooms who do this, but instead of just teaching foundational skills in English or in Spanish, we reimagine where there's this space where we say to students something like, I know many of you speak different languages with your families at home. Different languages have different sounds, and some even have different alphabets. I'm going to show you a letter. Let's hear how it sounds in English. If you have this letter in your language, have you seen it before? How do you pronounce it? So being able to bring their understanding, discussions about their language resources together in conversation. I think that this approach demands several important pedagogical shifts. Often, the perceived differences of emergent bilinguals, especially in the US context, is misunderstood. And often, students who are not considered standard readers are considered liabilities. So in asking children to share their resources, teachers have to detach their notions of emergent bilinguals' lack of resources from reading instruction and assume strengths. Second, this is a pivotal shift for teachers because teachers must find the time for emergent bilinguals to integrate and bring together their knowledge. And right now, this space sits outside of curriculum and therefore doesn't exist. So we need to find spaces where students can bring their linguistic knowledge they possess and connect it to the new information that they're acquiring in school. I'm going to skip this one on assessment because I want to go to my takeaways. So I think what I want to leave our small temporary community together with is to think about the expectation that instruction designed for monolingual students would have the same effect on emergent bilinguals is an example of monolingual bias. And we need to think about, where does monolingual bias show up perhaps in our work, in our implications, how it's implemented in policy. And that reading is really a multidimensional process that students can engage in with their multilingualism, their multimodality, and their embodied experiences. They may have different interpretations. And translanguaging theory and pedagogy can be a means to expand different components of reading instruction to ensure that reading instruction is inclusive of emergent bilinguals resources. I'm going to end there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. Now we are going to open the floor for questions and comments. I think it will do the in-person room right here. So do we have from the audience here?
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really nice to see the work you've done and what bilingual education is looking like these days. So I have a question for you, and it has to do with the idea, what do we do as parents raising multilingual children when the discrimination happens before you enroll them in the school system? Meaning when you have to fill out that first questionnaire and they ask you, do you speak a language other than English? And you are forced to lie, because if you don't, they automatically are perceived as ESL needing. And even if you get them out of ESL, they still have this red flag attached to their profile the entire time they're in school. What do we do about that?
That's a great question, because yes, there's, in the 1970s, when I grew up in New York City, speaking Spanish was not perceived as an asset, which it is in many communities today. Still, there are communities that don't perceive Spanish, speaking as an asset. And so how do we so many students are siphoned into monolingual programs, and their parents think that they're doing their children a service because they're giving them a leg up, let's say, in the US society. First of all, I think it's important to turn around the idea, and this doesn't exist everywhere, but that bilingual programs are remedial programs, or that, like you're talking about, that it's a stigma. Bilingual education is really political in the United States. So in some communities, it's thought about as a gifted program, and you'll find a lot of high income students in the middle class, high income students. But in communities of color, it may be seen in the light that you're talking about. I think it's important to have educational campaigns within schools, so that you invite parents, you have bilingual professionals, students who graduated from the program, to demonstrate what a strength it can be. And I think starting there, but you're right. When parents are asked to fill out that home language survey when the kid enters school, a lot of parents may have heard from their communities, oh, don't write that you speak Spanish or whatever language it is. But I think it's important for school districts, and this goes back to, I forgot your name, who asked about policy this morning. How do we translate our findings, both the quantitative findings that we've heard about today, qualitative findings, into policies which uplift bilingualism and provide information about bilingualism to teachers, to parents, in ways that promote it, right? And has positive effect on communities.
Thank you, Laura. Let's see if we have, I think we have one question online. Kaya.
So no, there are currently no questions online.
We see there one chat, so that's not a question. Then we have a question over here.
Hello.
Hi.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm wondering, do bilingual people translate in their head from one language to another?
That's a great question. I think it's very individual and I'm just speaking anecdotally. I don't know if there's someone who knows this better than I do, but I'm going to give the example of my husband, who is Italian and who is an economist. He studied in the US, and he was invited to Italy to give a talk. And when he started talking, and he lived in Italy until he was 26 years old. When he started talking, he thought to himself, oh my God, I don't know how to speak about economics in Italian. I have, so I think language, I'm thinking of Titone's talk again. Our bilingualism interacts with all these components: time, context, social. And so I think it really depends. If you experience something, as someone who was born in New York but lived in Colombia, if I'm talking about something that happens 25 years ago in Bogota and I was there, I'll tell you in Spanish. So I think it's very different for different bilinguals. But I do think, my doctoral advisor was Ofelia Garcia, so I am very much in the translanguaging scholarship. I think it's natural for people to use all of their languages within learning. I think sometimes it has to be unlocked. So when I tell my undergraduates, for example, that they can take notes in Chinese, they're like, really? I'm not supposed to do everything in English when I'm sitting in your classroom? And I said, no. If you think taking notes in Chinese while we're learning helps you, then that's great for you. So I think that's a long answer to, I think it's very individual.
Can I have one more? I have one more question. I'm sorry. Do you think bilingual children have a smaller vocabulary than their monolingual counterparts?
I think, and I'm not remembering the paper, but there's probably been more. I read a paper, now I'm thinking a while ago, so I don't remember the exact name, by a speech therapist who was talking about that if you add the words in Spanish and English, for example, or the words in the two languages, that you'll see that the amount of vocabulary is comparable to a monolingual, but it may appear to be less if you ask in one language. And somebody may be able to give you that citation, or I'm sure there's more than one citation about that.
Thank you. Two more questions. I was just going to say, the young lady on the back. Yes. Hi. Your question was really good. And I was going to ask you, I was expecting a response from you that I did not hear. And I was just like, what? And then I realized that I am the person that probably is wrong. So I want to share this. Okay. I want to share this. So you're right. Do we translate when we are speaking? And I will say, I do not. But if you read the cognitive literature on bilingualism and language development and all that, it wouldn't be efficient to keep translating on your brain, right? It wouldn't be efficient. It will be too demanding. And many theories assume that language is fluid. It shouldn't be put in barriers. But we're bilinguals, and there's so many barriers also. And then when you said that you actually believe that it depends, then I realized that the example you gave about your Chinese students, that can we do that in Chinese? I realized, oh my God, I'm being biased in some way to believe that we should stick to one language when we are thinking. And you're right, we shouldn't be. And I think that's the translanguage part that I always struggle to understand, where we actually can facilitate and kind of embrace that other language, right? And so thank you for doing that. And thank you, young scholar, I should say.
Yes.
I can make my question. Okay. So thank you for your presentation. And I particularly appreciated the ratio-linguistic perspective. I wanted to know if in your work, or how does your work touch on awareness of assessment programs, policies in schools being a listening subject that racializes emergent bilinguals. I asked this question in part because of my recent experience teaching teachers, and them having like a hard time thinking that, there is some kind of discrimination in the work that they do. And I was trying to explain that that's implied in some of the policies and assessments.
Right. And I think it's really important for teachers not to feel that they're the ones who are guilty, that it's really a structural thing. And the paper that I wrote with Dr. Kate Seltzer called Always at the Bottom, Language Ideologies, that's published in the Journal of Literacy Research, I think goes to that point, because I first, and I didn't talk about my assessment research, I first looked at assessments and thought about how to make them in favor of multilingualism to understand broad understanding of reading. And what I found is that a lot of teachers were like, but no, if the bilingual students are appearing stronger, we're making the bilingual students appear stronger than they actually are. Therefore, that must be wrong, because people were operating with this idea that, oh, they're always low performing. If the assessments show that they're performing higher, then something must be wrong with the assessment. So that's why we wrote that paper. So I would encourage you to read that paper. And I think it's helpful. It's a longer paper because it's for academics, it's not for teachers. But parts of that paper I think would be helpful for teachers to consider. In what ways have tools like assessments been positioned that I just accept as natural that maybe I should reconsider?
Well, thank you. If you all don't mind to add just one more minute, we have 2 more questions over here. Would that be okay?
Just to add to the question about whether we bilinguals translate in our brains, there's not a lot of literature already indicating that in bilinguals, both languages are active all the time. It's not that you turn one switch and then you put Spanish on and they turn the other one switch and then you have English on. So, and there's many cues in the environment and the speakers that allows bilinguals to determine which language to focus on, which to inhibit, and which ones to turn on. So both languages are completely active all the time. In the other piece related to vocabulary, that we can also look at the concept of total vocabulary that looks at the vocabulary that is existing in one language and as well as in the other language as a good measure of looking at the comprehensive vocabulary of bilinguals.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Victoria Batten. I come from Benedict College here in Columbia, South Carolina. And my question is this. First off, did I hear you say that standard readers are a liability? And if so, I'm just asking, and if so, can you clarify?
Yeah, no, I did not say that. I said that sometimes bilingualism is seen as a liability in school, especially if the students are racialized emergent bilinguals. So
did you say
well,
standardized
yeah,
reading?
what I meant is that, let's say, for example, I grew up in a home with very few books. My mom comes from Boyaca, Colombia, which is a very rural area. I was a very literate person when I went into my first grade classroom because I heard copious amount of stories, right? And if someone assessed me, they would say this person, like this first grader, is perhaps destined for failure, right? Like she didn't know the word, she doesn't know the alphabet, doesn't know this, this, and this. But in fact, if you dig deeper and you think about the types of literacy resources are different. So I think that's the point that I wanted to make, is that bilinguals, especially within the US context, may come with other resources. And rather than seeing their bilingualism as a liability, I want people to see their varied resources, which may be hidden. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura, for your wonderful presentation and challenging us to think about bilingual education. And thank you for the audience for great questions and feedback. Our next session will run on time, so which means you have a little bit short time of a restroom break and getting more coffee. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the other sessions this afternoon.